75 years ago, in World War II, Lieutenant John F. Kennedy and 12 crew members were on a late-night patrol of the South Pacific Ocean when they had a devastating encounter with a Japanese destroyer.
But the future 35th president and his crew beat the odds and survived the crash deep in enemy territory. Jamie Richardson and I are here to take you inside the crash and rescue that would help shape President Kennedy's life on the premiere episode of our new podcast, JFK 35.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Welcome to the first episode of the JFK Library Foundation's new podcast, JFK 35. I'm Matt Porter.
And I'm Jamie Richardson. In this new podcast, we'll take you in for a closer look at President Kennedy's life and his time in office through the documents, photos, and artifacts found right here in the archives at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum in Boston.
And we're also here to introduce you to the people behind the scenes at the library, including our passionate archivists, curators, and educators, all to give you a better look at the nation's 35th president and how his legacy continues to shape our world today.
Our topic today involves the 75th anniversary of the destruction of JFK's patrol torpedo boat, the PT-109, and the ensuing rescue of its crew. During the night of August 1st into the 2nd in 1943, the 80-foot boat was struck in the South Pacific by a Japanese destroyer, the Amagiri. The PT boat itself was destroyed.
And on that night, Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, commander of the PT-109, led his crew members to a nearby set of islands. JFK swam miles in enemy waters to try to find help. Days later, he encountered two native coast watchers who carried a message to the Allies. A rescue was mounted on the morning of August 8th, almost 7 days after the crash of the PT-109.
Our podcast's first guest will take us deeper into this dramatic story. Museum curator Stacey Bredhoff curated the Young Jack exhibit in the museum, which features this PT-109 story. Stacey, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Stacey, can you set the stage for us? What were JFK and his crew doing out there on the night of when the PT-109 was hit?
So the PT-109 was on a routine patrol, and it was a very, very dark night, and they were rammed by a Japanese destroyer, Amagiri. There was a huge explosion. The boat was sunk. 2 men instantly died, and through the night, the remaining crew and JFK clung to what was left of a piece of the boat. And then in the early morning light, it seemed that the best solution was to swim to a nearby island. They had every expectation that, they were surrounded by the Japanese, so they realized that they needed to get to land quickly.
Was anybody out there looking for them? Did they know what had happened?
Well, because of the explosion that was witnessed from afar, the presumption was that there were no survivors, so there were no immediate rescue teams looking for them.
Stacey, I've heard that not everybody who was involved in the crash was a great swimmer, and I think JFK had to go to some pretty extensive means to get some of his crew to those islands that night, right?
Yeah, so actually one of his crew was so badly injured, he was burned, that he was unable to swim. And so JFK took the belt of this man's life vest in his teeth and towed him the entire way to the island.
Well, that's pretty amazing that, anyone could do that under that situation. When they got to the islands, what was to do from there? What was JFK as the commander trying to do?
Yeah, so he's still commander. I mean, there's no boat, but he still is the commander. And so every night, in the cover of darkness, he would swim out into the channel hoping to encounter some PT boat, and they never did. And so he and his crew actually swam from island to island. They were subsisting on coconuts. And finally, one day, JFK encountered these 2 native islanders in a canoe. They had been sent by an Australian coast watcher. And JFK, first of all, convinced them that he was not Japanese and explained his situation. And the native islanders showed him how to carve a message into a coconut. And they took that coconut back to the coast watcher, and that's what eventually led to their rescue.
And so what was the message that Kennedy wrote on that coconut to get the Navy's attention?
So the message read, Noro Island, which was the name of the island, commander, native knows position, he can pilot, 11 alive, needs small boat, Kennedy. And actually, that little shard of coconut got back to JFK, and he later had it mounted into a paperweight, and it remained on his desk really for the rest of his life.
It's incredible, and it's I feel like one of our prized features in the Young Jack exhibit. It's so special.
I think it's really one of the most unique and significant pieces in the whole collection because, without it, JFK wouldn't have survived. And just the fact that it was always in such close proximity to him shows how important it was to him. And so, it's important to us.
And with the coconut on his desk in the Oval Office, did he ever talk about his experience a lot to visitors, or did he talk about what happened to him in World War II?
He did talk about it. I mean, it was a transformative experience, and he didn't talk about it in a boastful way, but it was a very important experience in his life. And in fact, he had on display in the Oval Office a model of the PT-109 boat. And so he would kind of use that model to explain to people what happened. And in fact, we have, I think, a few photographs of him kind of pointing out various things on the boat. We happen to have that model on display now as well.
Now, these PT boats, they weren't very big. These were kind of risky missions, challenging these larger ships, right?
Yeah, I mean, they were there to really make it very difficult for the Japanese ships to supply provisions to their forces. And so they were armed with torpedoes, and their logo was mosquito because they were very quick and they were small and they would just go zipping around the waters.
Was this the end, after this crash, was this the end for JFK's tour of duty, or did he continue on in the Navy for a little bit after that?
So he was injured during the event. The initial explosion kind of threw him up against the wall, and he already had back issues, and so it really exacerbated his back condition. But he recovered for some period of time and then actually took command of another PT boat, PT-109. That boat was actually involved in a rescue mission later, just shortly after he took over. And then eventually a doctor ordered him off the boat because he was in very frail and kind of mentally and physically exhausted.
It's incredible. I think we talk about PT-109 all the time, but then to think he went on to do even more is incredible. So how did this affect him later in life? Did he use this in any way as a veteran when he was campaigning? Or
certainly it had a transformative effect on him and his view of war. It certainly cured him of any romantic notions he might have had of war. Losing those two crewmen, was a very significant event that really stayed with him. And I think it really helped to shape his view of war and peace and how persistent he was in his quest for peace. Those were kind of the attitudes that he brought into the Oval Office. In addition to that, it really helped to shape his public persona as a war hero. So when he came back from the war, it was shortly after that he decided to enter politics. And he came from a family that was very wealthy and prominent, had a lot of influence, had a lot of contacts with the press, and his story was promoted and circulated nationally, and he became known as a war hero.
Now, from what I've read, there, during the campaign, there were actually these tie clips shaped like the PT-109. Why did people wear those? Why were those handed out during the campaign?
Well, I think, post-war in the United States, there were so many people who could relate to having served in World War II. And so that is one aspect of JFK's background and kind of qualifications for office that was really emphasized. And so one of the most popular, it was almost used like a campaign button. There were these PT-109 tie clips, and also for women there were pins for them to wear. I think something else that's really fascinating is that when he was elected president, the surviving members of the Amagiri, the Japanese destroyer that actually sunk his boat, sent him a congratulatory message. And we actually have that message also on display in our museum.
So one thing to think about, that it strikes me is that you have these enemies in World War II, which didn't happen that long before JFK was elected, and you have the crew members of this destroyer that could have killed him, sending him this congratulatory message. It's kind of a wonderful, very JFK-esque thinking about peace and mending ways.
Well, I mean, I think it really speaks to a spirit of reconciliation on the part of the Japanese and the Americans.
Obviously, you've mentioned that this was a big moment in his life, and do you think that he reflected on this, particularly as he made speeches for peace?
Well, I think what's important is that a war for him was not a theoretical thing or an abstraction of any kind. He experienced war. He lost a brother to the war. He lost 2 of his crew members. You know, he had to have carried those experiences into his strategies as president.
Stacey, thank you so much for taking the time. Your insights, of course, on those 7 nights that happened 75 years ago this year are very much appreciated.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Well, now that we've had a chance to hear more about the PT-109 and that heroic rescue, Jamie, I have a really interesting story from the library's Department of Education and Public Programs on how volunteer docents tell stories to our visitors in the museum.
I heard you went to the exhibits earlier this week. How did that go?
Well, I had the privilege of joining the hands-on cart program on this very topic, the PT-109. It's called Stranded at Sea, the PT-109 Story. Now, there's one of our volunteer docents walked guests through the entire episode and answered any questions they had.
I've been to a few of those cart presentations. They're always really cool because they use, photos, letters, sometimes even props to really get the story across.
Exactly. And all the docents who are here volunteer to do these presentations. They're not paid. They train for months to give tours and do these hands-on cart programs and add a bit of their own personality and perspective to make them all really unique. Now, last week I spoke with Carolyn Clark from Brookline, Massachusetts, which is also where JFK is from. She's a retired teacher and has been here at the library for 10 years. Let's listen in as Carolyn tells the PT-109 story to visitors.
Can you find John Kennedy in the picture? Where is he? Point him out to me. Far right. That's right. He's over here on the right.
Docent Carolyn Clark grew up in Brookline during JFK's 1960 campaign.
But as a teenager during John Kennedy's presidency, I really wasn't particularly engaged with politics. What am I holding?
Now, 58 years later, she finds herself at the Kennedy Library working directly with visitors to teach them about the 35th president.
So I thought the Kennedy Library would be a wonderful place to learn about my own historical period and also to engage with people in an educational way. These PT boats could go about 50 miles an hour, about 44 knots.
The JFK Library has almost 40 volunteer docents who serve as tour guides. They also run interactive programs with the help of push carts that can be set up and broken down at different exhibits.
A lot of museums have hands-on carts.
This is Catherine Gilliland. She oversees the docent program and designed the PT-109 cart for the library.
You may have seen them in a science museum, an art museum. A lot of times they demonstrate a process or kind of a small story.
This was the insignia that was worn by the crew of the PT boats. Can you describe it to me? What is it?
But it's interactive and they get to touch objects related to the story. They also get to see archival photographs from our collection.
What's another really annoying insect that we swat? Mosquitoes, that's right. What you're seeing here is the insignia of the PT boat, and what it is a mosquito sitting on top of a torpedo.
Gilliland says designing a cart program is an extensive process, a process that begins in the museum.
Means talking to visitors in the museum, watching visitors a lot, just watching their behavior, the amount of time they spend at particular exhibits or particular items. I get a sense of what they know and what they want to know, what they're curious about. And then I start developing a prototype.
Gilliland researches every part of the story, including looking for objects from the period.
I found a battle lantern. It's a military term for a flashlight on eBay. It's from a real PT boat, and it's probably 2 or 3 pounds in weight, but it is from a real PT boat made of metal. I didn't have to go very far to find a model of the PT boat in our museum store, and I all of a sudden became a person who puts together plastic models with glue. It's actually really fun.
After building the cart, Gilliland's work isn't over.
It's the Japanese boat, the Amagiri.
She spends hours with docents like Carolyn Clark to help them tell the story in a compelling way.
Cuts the boat in half. There's a huge explosion, a huge fire. Gasoline spills really all over the surface of the water. Many of the men are blown off the ship. Kennedy is slammed against the cockpit with his bad back. There are flames everywhere, and then the Amagiri silently disappears into the fog.
Two of the most striking objects in the cart are a pair of three-dimensional outlines made of plastic. One is of the PT-109, and the other is the massive Japanese destroyer, the Amagiri.
And then the Amagiri, about 6 or 7 of those little PT boats. So it's a lot bigger, and you just imagine this giant ship coming toward this tiny boat.
Probably the most unique part of the story is how JFK finally contacted the Navy. The Navy assumed Kennedy and his crew had all died, leaving the future president swinging from island to island looking for help that wasn't coming.
And although he couldn't communicate with them,
but as Clark explains, the young lieutenant would finally come across 2 Solomon Islanders who found a way to help.
Well, one of these men goes up a tree and he takes down one of these. What am I holding?
Coconut.
It's a coconut, that's right. And he indicated to John Kennedy that with his knife in this green coconut, he could inscribe a message.
She pulls a large reproduction of a coconut to show her audience. Gilliland says the carts bring museum exhibits out from behind the glass case for visitors.
By the end of the story, they're able to connect the dots, and they're really struck by the fact that he swam 3.5 miles with Patrick McMahon on his back with his life jacket strap preserver in his teeth, and that he kept his crew, kept the morale up, was a leader at such a young age. They know that he was a war hero, but when they know why and how, it's really even more incredible, I think, for visitors.
And I want to show you what his message was. Maybe you can read the message for us. This is what John Kennedy succeeds in carving into a very small piece of coconut.
Nauru Island commander, native knows position, he can pilot, 11 alive, need small boat, Kennedy.
I've met wonderful people. I've used my French at times. So I've found it's been a very enriching experience, and I have no desire at this point, after 10 years, to stop doing it.
When asked how the crash influenced JFK in the future as president, Clark offered an answer based on her own experience telling the PT-109 story.
It wasn't the event, the encounter with the Amagiri, that was the defining act. It was how he acted after that.
Nice story. How did the guests react to Carolyn's program?
Well, it was pretty amazing. There were probably about 10 to 15 people in the Young Jack exhibit when Carolyn started, and most of them joined the program to listen to the whole thing. Now, one gentleman there actually lived during the 1960 campaign, and he mentioned owning one of those PT-109 tie clips we talked about earlier. Again, those were the tie clips given out during the campaign to remind people of JFK's service during World War II.
That's great. I love when visitors can come in and kind of share something of their own experiences and backgrounds with JFK. And speaking of great stories, I would love to touch up on one more thing before we wrap up. After the PT-109, as Stacey had mentioned earlier, JFK served briefly on another PT boat, and then eventually he was declared unfit for service. He came back home and he was pretty, beaten up mentally and physically from everything he had gone through. However, he was not one to be sidelined and one to be in on the action, so he was able to get a job with the Hearst newspapers through a connection with his dad. So he went out to San Francisco as the formation of the UN was happening, and he wrote 17 articles at about 300 words each. In the archives, we have copies of all of these articles, and one is in this Young Jack exhibit we have. So this one that we have on display, he's writing from the point of view of a service member who's just experienced war firsthand, and he disclaims that while he can't represent the views of all service members, he does say that veterans at the talks are worried that agreements there might not be strong enough to keep the peace. But he finishes on a hopeful note, saying, "There is one ray of shining bright light. That is the realization felt by all the delegates that humanity cannot afford another war."
Jamie, that's a pretty interesting article considering JFK's work as president on disarmament and the nuclear test ban treaty. Those were important parts of his legacy today. I think people often think of Kennedy as a born politician and this great orator, but in his younger years, Kennedy was on the path of becoming a writer, maybe a professor. Some historians believe it was only when his older brother died in World War II that President Kennedy felt compelled to take up his brother's mantle and go into politics.
That's right, and President Kennedy was later asked why he left the reporting job after a kind of short stint there. He said, "A reporter is reporting what happened. He's not making it happen." So clearly, President Kennedy already had in mind a desire to be an active participant rather than what he thought of as passively reporting what was happening.
Yeah, he's definitely was not one to sit on the sidelines for sure. And with that, we are wrapping up our first episode of JFK 35.
Hooray!
Stay with us next time as we bring you more stories from the JFK Library.
And if you have questions or story ideas, email us at jfk35pod@jfklfoundation.org or tweet at us at JFK Library using the hashtag JFK35. And you can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram.
And hey, if you liked what you heard today, please consider subscribing to our podcast or leaving us a review on iTunes. Definitely, we thank you for listening to our first episode. Hope you enjoyed it, and please have a great week.